Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of the Bitcoin Hour. I am Dave Bradley. Today, we're going to be talking about something that crosses over with the podcast that I was just on. I was just on the Bitcoin podcast with Walker, and we had a hour and a half long rip about all of the things that are wrong with the world and the current setup of the world. And one of the interesting things that came out of there that I wanted to expand upon a little bit is this idea of the greater good. So, talking about the greater good, I think the greater good as a general concept is something that most people can get behind. This is something wherein the idea basically is that we want the best outcome for the most people possible. And this is something that kind of underlies a lot of collectivist policies and a lot of the ideals that lead to the confiscation and redistribution of resources all come from this general idea that there is this achievable objective notion of the greater good out there, wherein, by redistributing these resources using violence, the government can achieve an outcome that is better for more people than if they hadn't have done it this way. And this ends up being a justification for most of the resource confiscation that we see from governments. And when a person looks at this idea that we want to achieve the greater good, it's easy to buy into those motivations. And if you don't look further than sort of skin deep, if you don't look very far into the realities of the world, it might seem like taking some resources from those who have an excess of resources and spending them to the benefit of those who have not enough resources would lead to this outcome that is described as the greater good. But there's a couple problems with that. Namely, first of all, that this redistribution of resources will inevitably be squandered. Whenever the government takes resources to do something, first they take their cut off the top, and there will be bureaucratic studies and layer upon layer of fiat science and intellectualism used to determine how that money is actually spent. And so that money inevitably will largely be misspent. And instead of going to provide resources to those who have fewer resources as originally intended, the money will be spent on government programs that enrich those who are either in government or adjacent to the government. So that's the first big problem with the confiscation of resources in an attempt to reach the greater good. The next thing is that it really just distorts all the incentives for everyone involved. And, the saying of give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, or teach a man to fish. And this really is true at the very basic level when it comes to this redistribution of resources. When you take resources from one person and give them to the other, you've distorted the resources of both people involved. The person who had their resources confiscated has less of an incentive to continue to work hard to build more resources, to build more progress and more wealth in the world. And the person who received these free resources without having to do the work for them has now been disincentivized to continue to work harder, because they know that a lesser volume of work will lead to free resources. And so inevitably, the outcome ends up being like most anything that any government touches, like the Cobra effect that I touched on in a previous episode. Almost everything the government ever does results in the exact opposite outcome of what the stated intentions were. And so those redistribution of resources not only wastes resources, it means that there will be fewer resources created in the future, and there will be fewer resources to go around as a whole. And it disincentivizes everyone involved from continuing to create more resources. And so that, I think, is the nuanced look at how we achieve a greater good. But the thing that really gets under my skin is this term that you hear all the time. And you hear it from people with the best of intentions. And this is the word we. And we, the collectivist we, is one of the most simple ways to hide such an insidious concept in plain sight. Because, you hear somebody say, you see a homeless person and somebody says something like, oh, we should do something about that, right? And normally when people use the word we, like if I were to call up a friend and say, hey, we should go for drinks, or we should go to a movie or something like that. We should do something. I'm proposing that we, the group of people in the conversation, take a certain action. But this collectivist we used to describe the we should do something state is not the same kind of we. It usually doesn't actually include the person that's using the term. So when they say we should do something about the homeless, they don't mean you and I and them and anyone else in the conversation. They don't mean that they want to be involved in actually spending their time or resources to help the condition of the homeless. What they actually mean is that they believe that this special group of people who have been granted the monopoly on violence should use that monopoly on violence to collect resources from those who have an excess of resources and redistribute those resources to those who have not earned as many resources, with the goal of achieving this greater good. And the fact is that none of that actually happens. When the special group of people that I'm describing, which is the government, obviously, in this case, decides to confiscate those resources, they just don't get spent in a way that ameliorates the outcome for people as a whole. And the fact is that history has shown that the single greatest driver of progress, of wealth, of the accumulation of more capital and more resources, and the ability for more people in the world to have more resources with which to provide for themselves and their families, the single greatest driver of an increase in those resources has been the power of capitalism. And that really has been what's floated the last 150 years or so of the modern world, is the idea that even though governments steal from us so drastically at an ever increasing rate by printing and devaluing the currency, we've still been able to increase our standard of living drastically over the last 150 years because the progress and the resource generation, the sheer amount of wealth that's been created by the relative level of capitalism that we've enjoyed over the last 150 years has been so drastic that it could even outpace the rate of government theft. And we're just now getting to a place where that rate of government theft is catching up with capitalism, and capitalism is no longer able to sustain growth over and above that level of theft. And that, I think, is where the greater good is really challenged at the highest degree, is that in the world that we're in now, more and more people are having worse outcomes because of the actions of the government, because of that wealth confiscation. And as more people realize that, my hope is that the word we changes back to its original meaning, and the idea that, I don't think that if you removed wealth redistribution with violence from the world, I don't think if governments were not confiscating resources and using them to fund programs for the poor and every other thing that they do with seemingly, in many cases, seemingly good intentions. I think if the government lost the ability to do that, as they are bound to do now that we have a form of money they can no longer print, I think as they lose that ability to do that, other people will step into those roles. It's not like philanthropy is a concept invented by the government. People will still give away their excess resources, but when they do it voluntarily, they do it with some skin in the game. And so they're people who give away their resources voluntarily to a charity are much less likely to give them to a charity that is known for being wasteful. Whereas it doesn't matter how wasteful you are. Everybody knows the government's wasteful. There's nothing known more broadly for being wasteful than the government, but they still have the right to confiscate those resources. And so, tying the concept of philanthropy back to the actual people who have earned the capital that they're going to be dispersing, I think is going to actually increase the positive outcomes and move us closer to a scenario like this imagined greater good that is described in all of these fairy tales sold to people in order to maintain their balance of power. So that is the state of the greater good. And we're coming up just on 10 minutes here. And I'm getting word from the studio that unfortunately, like everything else, the time thieves at the government have stolen the rest of this hour. And so that is all you get for the show today.